Good morning. I am one of 9 kiddos. Have 2 older brothers in my family. My oldest brother, Wayne, was an Army drill sergeant at the Canadian Forces all of his life. My brother Wayne loves to tell war stories and stories of soldiers training, and they're really a lot of fun to listen to. Each time he tells the story, it always gets bigger and better. Some of them have even been known to have elements of truth in them. I remember the time he talked about the military putting on a training day and had all these exercises planned, and one of them was going to be that a helicopter would fly across in front of the people. As it got in front of them, it would squat down close to the ground, and 4 guys with all their packs on and everything would jump out of the helicopter while it was still going, only 10 feet off the ground, and would roll and jump up, and then they'd set up all their gear, and away they go. So as the exercises are going on, the helicopter's coming in, the radio operator sends a message to the pilot and says, "You're too early. Drop out of sight." So he's flying in, and he drops down close to the ground, and the guy inside says, "That's our cue. Jump, 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 jump." And 4 guys jump out of a helicopter that's still 100 feet in the air and land it in the swamp. So about the time that the exercises were over, these 4 guys come dragging up out of the brush, wet and cold and all of that. Wayne loved to tell those stories. But the best part was to watch my kids as Wayne told the story. And then they would hurry away to go tell their friends the stories they'd heard from Uncle Wayne. That's what Mark does in his gospel. Mark's not an apostle. He hadn't traveled with Jesus. He's younger than the apostolic band. But whenever the apostles were in town, they always went to Mary's house and stayed there. Even when Peter was released from prison, first place he ran was Mary's house. Well, that's Mark's mother. So as the apostles sat around the table having coffee, talking in the morning and telling their stories of all the things that the Lord began to do and to teach, Mark listened to all of those stories. And he can't wait to run out and tell them. And like Ron was telling us yesterday, over and over again, Mark says, "And immediately, and immediately, and immediately, and immediately." He goes through all of these stories. You get to the end of the first chapter, you kind of want to say, "Mark, try the decaf." It seems like he's too pumped up with all that he has to say. But that's the picture Mark gives to us. Mark chapter 2 starts off with Jesus going to the synagogue in Capernaum. If you go to Capernaum, this is the gate of the city. The sign says, "The hometown of Jesus." That's Rebecca and I melting in the heat out in front of that gate. I think it's interesting, just next to where I'm standing, there's a cement post in the middle of the ground, and it's got a sign on it that says, "No shorts." If you go to Capernaum and you're wearing shorts, they provide for you a wrap to put around you. They say, "This is Jesus' hometown, and we expect you to show some respect." And that's my first wife and I. And we are actually standing in the synagogue that's in Capernaum. The synagogue is the one that's there now, but the remains of it is a white stone synagogue built upon the old black stone synagogue. The black stone is the one that was there that Jesus himself went into. I love this picture. I'm standing on the same steps that Jesus walked up, the black step when he went into the synagogue. I'm just showing you these pictures because I want to make a point that we believe that our Bible is inspired from Genesis to maps. That these places, these people, these events are real events. Not just a once upon a time in a faraway place, but real people, real buildings, real stones. Here's the wall of the synagogue. Look at the synagogue from a distance. Okay, just a little bit of the places where Jesus went. In Mark chapter 2, and that's our study for the day, Mark chapter 2 and the first 6 verses of Mark chapter 3, Jesus enters into conflict. Now, get the picture. We're in Mark 2, and he's already in stages of conflict with the religious leaders. I won't have time to develop the stories like I would like to do from this chapter, but here's what you'll see when you look at it. First of all, in chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, Jesus heals the man who's paralyzed, who's brought by his 4 friends on his bed. That's the one where Jesus is preaching and teaching, and the guys are up on top of the roof, tearing the roof apart. I can see Jesus trying to teach, and the dust and the dirt falling down around him as they lower the man down in front of him. And Jesus tells the man, "Your sins are forgiven." Now, it makes one say, no, that's not his problem. His problem is that he's paralyzed and he can't walk. But in essence, Jesus is saying that paralyzed state will only last for maybe 50 years. But a soul without sin lasts for all eternity. Let's deal with the real issue. They challenge him when Jesus says, "Son," there's relationship. "Son, your sins are forgiven." Huh! Who can forgive sins but God alone? They grumble. Jesus says, "That's my point. I am God. I can forgive sins." And then in chapter 2, verse 13, he calls Matthew. And again, they grumble because Matthew is not on the right side of the fence. And they would end up saying that Matthew throws a party and his friends come and they're all tax collectors. They got to be bad guys. Tax collectors and the sinners. And Jesus is in the crowd rubbing shoulders with them. They are trying to, those who would accuse Jesus are saying in essence, if he really knew these people, he wouldn't be there. And Jesus is saying, I really know those people, and that's why I'm there. Didn't come to call the righteous, came to call the sick. Came to provide healing for those who need it, not for those who think they are beyond it. So here's conflict over association with sinners. And Jesus is telling them, I did not come to be served, but to serve and give my life a ransom for many. In chapter 10:45, he will say. Then there's a conflict over fasting. Why is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples don't fast? Jesus would tell them, my disciples aren't going to fast for show. They'll fast for purpose. And when the time's right, when they need to fast, when the bridegroom is taken away, then they'll fast. And then the real issue that we see here in verse 23, Jesus is going to talk to them about the Sabbath in conflicts over keeping the Sabbath. You know, in the New Testament, anytime you read, and it was the Sabbath, you know there's going to be a problem. There's going to be a struggle within those pages, within those words. So Jesus talks to them about keeping the Sabbath. And he lets them know that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. We'll talk what that means in just a moment. And then in chapter 3, again, he's in the synagogue, this one we just saw. There's a man with a shriveled up hand, and everybody's watching. You know, they're looking to see, what's he going to do? What's he going to do? And Jesus knows exactly what they're thinking, and he's perturbed at them for their hardness of heart. And again, he does the right thing and restores the hand of the man on the Sabbath. Here's a conflict over whether we should do good or do evil. You can look at those passages later on. Let's talk quickly about this paralytic, the man who is paralyzed, who's brought to Christ by 4 friends who carry him there, and they can't get in the house because it's all so crowded. So they make their way up the roof, and most of those homes have stairs on the outside going up to the roof of the house. They tear up the tile and the grass and all of that stuff and create a hole big enough big enough to slide a man down through in his bed and lay him down in front of Jesus Christ. And Jesus can look at the man and address his real need. Son, your sins are forgiven. When they challenged Jesus about it, Jesus said, what's easier to say? Get up and walk? Or your sins are forgiven? But that you know, here's the point, that you know that the Son of Man has authority. That the Son of Man has the right to speak, the power to speak, the power to tell this person your sins are forgiven. He says, get up and walk. Pick up your bed and go. And the man can do so. And Jesus shows again his power over sin, his authority, his right to speak. This is like creation power. He just spoke and it was so. And Jesus can do that now and bring healing to this paralyzed man. It says in Mark chapter 2, verse 12, and he arose and immediately took up his pallet and went out in sight of all, so that they were all amazed and were glorifying God. And they were saying, we've never seen anything like this. You know why they said that? They'd never seen anything like that. Nobody just speaks with that kind of power, with that kind of authority. But God does. That's the point that Jesus would leave them with, that he is indeed God in the flesh, and he has the right to speak. Makes me think of the time in John chapter 7 when they send a band of soldiers to arrest Jesus. They come back empty-handed, and they say, well, where is it? They say, man, never has a man spoke like this man. Again, they recognize the authority of Jesus Christ. When the disciples are challenging him about fasting, they want the fast to put on the show, to be seen by men. And Jesus is saying, in essence, that's too shallow. It has no purpose. Not here to display our faith. When the time comes, my disciples will really fast when there's a spiritual need for it. True fasting is not for show, but for spiritual development. And then he talks to them about putting a new patch on an old garment. Don't have time to explore this. Pouring new wine into an old wineskin. You don't do that because the old skin is already rigid. It's hard. It's got its shape already. And pouring new wine into it, that wine's going to grow. It's going to expand. It's going to stretch, and the old skin's going to just burst. And what Jesus is telling them is Christianity is not simply a patch on Judaism, but rather it's going to take shape. It's going to develop. It's going to grow. It's going to expand beyond what Judaism can contain. And then he talks about the Sabbath in chapter 2, 23, and down through chapter 3, verse 6. The disciples walk through the grain field, and they grab a couple of handfuls of grain while they're walking, and they rub it in their hands and knock the shells off and then eat the grain. If your translation says corn, it's really not maize. It's talking about a wheat crop being described, which is quite lawful for a person to do, even in another man's field, according to the law. Deuteronomy 25:23, they had the right to go through and pick handfuls of grain and feed themselves along the way. But they say, well, you're breaking the Sabbath. Jesus' disciples and Jesus himself did not break the Sabbath. He created the Sabbath. Maybe they didn't follow all of the hundreds and hundreds of traditions that the Jewish leaders had developed over the years. But let's talk about this Sabbath for a minute. What is it? What does it mean? Is the Sabbath to be a law to restrict people? No. God meant for the Sabbath to be a blessing for his people, a special blessing from God. They saw the Sabbath as a test of faithfulness. It restricted them, it bound them so that they were not free to do much of anything. Man became a slave to keeping the Sabbath then during this time. That was not the intent or purpose that God had at all. You don't find that in the writings of God. Back in Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, we read about God creating the whole earth. And when he got to the end of it, what does he say? But, man, this is very good. And then he just sat back and he admired the creation that he made. And you can almost see God saying, man's going to be so pleased with this. But what I've made for him, he's going to love it and appreciate it and care for it. And this is going to be beautiful. And wow, this is so good. So God's resting is to stop and appreciate. And the heavens really do declare the handiwork of God. Psalms 19, verse 1. When the Hebrews were in Egypt, what was a land of blessing has become for them a land of slavery, a punishment, a time of hard labor and toil and even death. And the Hebrews couldn't stand it anymore. And what they could not do for themselves, that is, free themselves, God did for them, as Doug read for us a while ago. God said, I bore you on eagle's wings. I brought you out of that. But why did he bring them out? He brought them out to bring them to himself that they could have relationship. He said, I want to be your God. I want you to be my people. So with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, God powerfully brought them out of that land. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 15 says, you shall remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Because they were slaves with no rights, no freedoms, no break, no time off, God said, I can change all of that. And instantly did for them as he delivered them. I like the way he puts it in Exodus chapter 6, verse 6 and 7. He says, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burden of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from their bondage, and I also will redeem you with an outstretched hand and great judgments. And I will take you for my people, and I'll be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord who brought you out from under the burden of the Egyptians. God was their Redeemer. And that's why he gave them a Sabbath law, to remember the great blessings that God had given to them. The Sabbath was time for them to stop and just think about where we would have been had God not redeemed us and saved us. Who is the God that gave them the Sabbath law? Who was it that created the beautiful creation that they enjoyed? Wasn't it Jesus Christ? In John chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, John would tell us that Jesus was the one, and apart from him, nothing has come into being that has come into being. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 2, Colossians chapter 1, verse 16 would tell us that Jesus is the one who has created all, including the whole Sabbath law that was given to them at Mount Sinai. See, the Sabbath was to be like a wedding ring that a man might wear. Man wears the wedding ring, and every time he touches that ring, it reminds him of the relationship he has to his wife. It speaks of their promise, of their blessings, of their commitment. God gave the Sabbath to speak to the people of God's commitment to them. And it was to be a sign between you and me, he said, Exodus 31:13. Leviticus 23, he says, it is my appointed time. God appointed that time. God marked the days off on the calendar and said, these days we're going to get together and you're going to remember how much I love you and how I redeemed you. It's a blessing, not a curse. In fact, not only is there a seventh-day Sabbath, there was a week of Sabbath. Every 7 Sabbaths, there was a special Sabbath. There was a sabbatical year every 7 years when they and the land had to rest, and they couldn't even plant a crop. You say, well, how are we going to live without any crops coming in? God says, you're going to have to trust me. I'll double your blessings. Just trust me first. And then there was 7 sevens of years. And the year after that, the year of Jubilee, a special year of release and blessing. In all of this, God is saying, trust me. Enjoy the relationship. This is why He is called the Lord of the Sabbath. He made the Sabbath. He created it. He can rule it and He can overrule it. He gave it to bless people, not to punish them, not to hurt them. And although we know that we don't keep the Sabbath as Christians, our remembrance is not on a special day, but in a special feast we call the Lord's Supper. But beyond that, Hebrews chapter 4 tells us there yet remains a rest for the people of God. And you and I, through Jesus Christ, who delivers us, redeems us, and sets us free, will find a rest for all eternity. That's why Jesus said, come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will burden you beyond belief. No, I'll give you rest. I'll create a rest for you. So early in the ministry of Jesus, He meets so much conflict. But the crowds are amazed because they've never seen anything like this before. What Jesus said rang true. Jesus established His authority, His power to forgive sins because He's equal with God and is indeed God in the flesh. He establishes His right to heal, to do good, because He's the creator of the Sabbath. Jesus grieves greatly over their hardness of heart. They wanted to do harm, and Jesus wanted to do good. They wanted to kill Jesus. Jesus wanted to give life. No wonder there was a struggle. The Son of Man is indeed the Lord of the Sabbath. He has a rest for us. Trust Him. Trust Him. And we will enter into an eternal rest in time to come. God bless you. Jesus give you peace.